Alright guys, BLM here, back with a new video, and in this video, I'm back with another Survivor What If video, and this time I'll be tackling a bit of a smaller scale subject here, one that I think is a thought experiment that people have run through in the past, but I still want to talk about my thoughts on it here, and here we'll be talking about scenarios where the returnee captains end up swapping tribes. Now by that I obviously mean these seasons that have very limited returning players, to which those returning players are designated to different tribes. So here I'll be talking about the scenarios if they were on the other tribes from the ones that they were initially put on. And through that, we only have 5 seasons to run through here, so again, it is not that big of a topic here, but again, I still want to talk through it anyway. We're going to run through the eligible seasons in chronological order, starting off with Survivor Guatemala, which is probably the worst one to talk through, if I'm being honest, considering I feel like this is probably the season that the initial starting tribes mattered the least. Considering on Survivor Guatemala, by the time of the swap, which was episode 4, those swap tribes ended up being the alliances that continued moving forward instead of the original tribe. So through that, I think this experiment is a lot harder to do here, but here we will be saying that Stephanie was on the original Nakum, while Bobby John was on the original Yaksha. And for Stephanie, here she would end up being on the starting tribe with a person like a Judd and a Cindy, these two people that she later works with in the game anyway. I feel like they are probably likely to come together there. We do know that Danny and Stephanie also had a decent relationship, so I would not be surprised if they also get together. And considering Danny's relationship with Brandon, I feel like that is probably where we see the initial power structure land on this tribe, which through that would leave Margaret, Blake, Brooke, and Jim on the outs, and for Blake might be part of that as well, considering he would have been looked at as someone that they needed for physical strength early on. But really, I feel like Jim is probably still the first boot anyway. Well, I will say for Bobby John, I actually feel like his spot on Yaksha is a lot more interesting, where I don't know how well he gels with that group. Now, we do see him later work with Gary, and I feel like that's probably an instant relationship. Also, the likes of Amy is not too hard to see, but really the rest of the tribe do not seem like Bobby John's type of people. Now, really, Jamie and Bobby John have an interesting dynamic, where obviously they have a massive rivalry across the season, but I do feel like if they're on the original starting tribes and are working together from the very beginning, I do feel like it is more likely that they actually become friends like they did in Ponderosa. So maybe that is where the initial group starts off, and considering the dynamics of the original Yaksha, it did seem like Jamie had a good relationship with the likes of Rafe. So maybe that is the majority alliance here. That would be a 5-person alliance of Rafe, Gary, Jamie, Bobby John, and Amy, leaving Lydia, Brian, Brianna, and Morgan on the outs, which is not that dissimilar from the initial power structure anyway. So again, like realistically, most of these two scenarios play out very similarly. Through that, I do think the initial boots are probably kind of similar as well. And if we're saying that Stephanie and Bobby John swap spots on the swap tribes as well, they both end up being in the majority of their tribes up until the merge anyway. So again, I do feel like they're both probably in it till the merge, though I do think the merge is where we do come across some more interesting scenarios there, where now Stephanie would be on the outs along with Danny, Gary, and Brandon, though at this point, is Stephanie able to win back the likes of Cindy and Judd, these two people that in this scenario she would have worked with since the very beginning? And also, how would her relationship with Rafe go? Someone that she obviously became very close to in the real life scenario, but in this scenario she wouldn't have been able to even be on a tribe with him until the merge. Or I feel like Rafe is someone that wouldn't really bond with Bobby John in the same way that he did with Stephanie. So through that, I would not be surprised if Stephanie ends up winning out in this battle anyway, just due to these other connections that, again, I really just do not see Bobby John holding control after a merge, or maybe Bobby John and Jamie stick together, but I really feel like Bobby John would probably still be an early boot anyway, considering at this point there was just such an anti-returnee sentiment anyway, to where I think they would have been very willing to get rid of Bobby John. Also, Bobby John is really just not that good of a player, and I just really do not see this group really gelling with him, to where I just see so many more natural relationships for Stephanie, and with her side also having the likes of Danny and Brandon and Gary, I do feel like they would probably be able to pull some people over. Though I think that's really determined on how rigid the likes of Judd and Cindy were by that point, and how many promises the likes of Bobby John made to them, which, to be honest, I don't really see Bobby John doing. So really, I do feel like Stephanie is probably in it for the long haul anyway, while Bobby John is probably an earlier merge boot either way, though either way, neither of them would have had a chance at winning a jury vote, considering how anti-returnee the entire cast was, and also how bitter a lot of them were at Stephanie by the end of it, to where I really do not see a winning trajectory for Stephanie either way, but I do think a lot of the game probably plays out similarly, though obviously with radically different dynamics by the end game. Next up for Redemption Island, to be honest, this is the big topic. This is the one that obviously a lot of people talk about, and this is the main reason I wanted to make this video, was because of the talk of, does Boston Rob do what he does on Redemption Island if he was on Zapatera? And truth be told, probably not. However, I do think he does better on Zapatera than the likes of Russell, where I think Russell, no matter what, was in a bad spot coming into the season. However, I do think Zapatera was probably the worst starting spot for Russell, with him being on this more no-nonsense sort of tribe, these group of people that were just very serious in the way they handled camp life, and through that, obviously, Russell just does not gel with that group, and through him doing the same thing that he did previously, obviously it would lead to him being an early boot. While with Russell on Ometepe, I do feel like he has a bit more inroads. However, I think realistically, it probably still leads to him being an early boot. Just because, again, like, this is immediately after they just saw Samoa and here's his villains. I feel like there's no real way that they were going to let Russell make that deep of a run, especially if he continues to do the exact same thing again, which 100% he would try to do. I think in this scenario, Russell would 100% try to work with Natalie, Ashley, and Andrea. And to be honest, like, maybe it would have been successful for a little bit. I do think he would have had a lot of conflicts with Philip. I do think Philip probably would have been an earlier boot in this situation. Also, considering how anti-returnee Francesca was, I think that also would have led to her being an earlier boot. But, I mean, like, at the end of the day, like, I do think Boston Rob is a much more savvy player than the likes of Russell, especially in being able to keep a group together. And through that, I would not be surprised, especially considering the target on his back, that eventually, if not even instantly, the group that he wants to work with does end up going against him. Where despite, obviously, the reputation of the Ometepe tribe of being this tribe of, like, goats that didn't know what to do, like, in reality, I do think Ashley is actually a pretty competent player that just saw Rob as more of a shield for her to use. I think Christina could have been a pretty competent player as well without the likes of Boston Rob being there. I think Andrea wouldn't have been as afraid to flip against Russell as she had been with Boston Rob. So I think just in general, I do not expect Russell to have a deep run here. However, on the opposite side of things with Rob and Zapatera, I do think it would go a lot better for him than it would have gone for Russell, where again, obviously with Russell, we see him be on the outs right away. He gets taken out at the first vote, to the point where they throw a challenge to vote him out. I think if Rob is there, I think Zapatera probably just dominates the challenges. Like, I do think while Ometepe did have Grant, who was very good at challenges, particularly at the very end of the pre-merge, I do think Zapatera as a whole was by far the better tribe. And I think with Boston Rob alongside them, I do think they would be a dominant force in the pre-merge. And I also feel like Boston Rob would still be able to get a decent stranglehold on that tribe. Now, would he be in the position he would be on Ometepe? I do not think so. I don't think he would have that much of a stranglehold, but I do think he would bond with the likes of a Mike and a Steve. I do think people like a Stephanie and a Krista would have been an early boot on that tribe anyway, and I do think if they had gotten to the merge with numbers, I think Boston Rob's just easily sailing for a lot of the game. Now, I will say I do think, again, the Zapateras are a more competent group of players by the end of it, to where I would expect them to take a shot at Boston Rob by the end of it, but I think Boston Rob is still pretty much locked for the merge. Again, like, Boston Rob is still a much more self-aware player than the likes of Russell. I think Boston Rob is a player that is able to blend in a bit more in social dynamics and doesn't immediately ostracize himself. And while Boston Rob is obviously known for this extremely domineering gameplay, I do feel like that style of gameplay would still have worked on Zapatera. Though again, like, it's just, I think by the end game, I do think more people would have been willing to flip against him. Though also knowing Boston Rob, he probably would have tried to get rid of some of those people by the end. And someone like a David Murphy, and he would obviously have to defend against the likes of Mike and Steve by the end game. But I do think Boston Rob, either way, was probably set up to do decent on Redemption Island. But I do think his road on Zapatera would be a lot tougher, considering I do think on Zapatera he does lack the very blatant goats that he had to drag to the end in Ometepe and someone like a Philip and a Natalie. I do think on Zapatera he doesn't really have that person. Maybe a Sarita if she's able to get to the merge, or like a Julie. But yeah, I do think it is a tougher road for him, but I wouldn't completely rule him out there. Next up, we're moving on to Survivor South Pacific, where here we're obviously swapping Coach and Ozzy. So Ozzy is now on Opolu and Coach is now on Savaii. And I will say, these groups do not work at all, do they? Like, it's so weird looking at these groups to where I feel like even though it was random draw to determine which tribe went where, the tribes felt perfect for those people. I feel like Coach is a person that kind of just perfectly blends in with this bigger group of misfits in like a Sophie, Albert, a Brandon Hance, Edna, Rick. Like, I feel like that feels like a decent landing spot for Coach, while putting him on a tribe with Jim Rice and Whitney and Keith and Elise and Papa Bear. It really just does not feel like a good tribe for Coach. Now, I don't think he's necessarily an early boot. Again, I think at the end of the day, people like a Semhar, people like a Papa Bear seem like earlier boots, but I do wonder how he would have worked with Jim Rice. I think at the end of the day, that probably determines how he does in the game, where Jim Rice is a player that really took control of Savaii and continuously made moves against Ozzy's best interests. And I do think how Coach would have interacted with Jim Rice would have a significant effect on his route in the game. And I don't know how it goes. Again, at the end of the day, I don't really see him blending in with the people like a Keith and a Whitney. I could see him working with Don and Cochran, though. But at that point, is he just a big threat at that point for Jim, where Jim himself wanted to work with Cochran and Don? Like, I do feel like Coach could have been in trouble by the end of the pre-merge, just because I don't find a supernatural landing spot for him that leaves him in a power position in the game. So I do think Coach probably struggles on Savaii. Ozzy on Upolu, though, I think Ozzy's fine no matter what tribe he's on. I mean, he's Ozzy. He is obviously going to be renowned for his physical strength and through that be kept around for a while. Though I will say in terms of natural allies here, it's not looking that great. I mean, he does have Michaela, who does seem like someone that would work with Ozzy. Brandon is someone that admired Ozzy, so I'm pretty sure they would have worked together. But like really outside that, like I really do not see Ozzy blending in with this group that well. I do think they would have kept him around as a physical asset. However, I struggle to find like where exactly the true core of the tribe would be. I do think Sophie and Albert would obviously still work together. And we know that they had a relationship with Michaela. But would that be good enough to connect them back to Ozzy, where we know that, like Ozzy and Sophie did not get along? At the same time, we had someone like Brandon who had a more antagonistic relationship with Michaela. So again, I feel like without Coach there, I do think it significantly changes up the dynamics here, where through that it doesn't give Sophie and Albert the clear consensus that they had. Well, also, Ozzy is a bit more of a free agent in this scenario, so I'm not entirely sure how things work out. Though, I would think in this scenario, probably someone like Edna ends up being a relatively early boot. I think Michaela probably ends up making the merge. And maybe Christine and Stacy are still probably earlier boots as they were in the real life scenario anyway. But coming to the merge, again, like I just think it's a bit more all over the place. I do think the two sides are probably still solidified to where I find it tough to believe that they wouldn't keep together. Like Ozzy might still make the move to throw himself into Redemption Island to keep his tribe in the numbers, but realistically I think it's just a bad scenario for both of them, to where Ozzy's someone that's always going to be a relatively early move after the merge and through that need to win out through Redemption Island, which he probably would. But would he win that final challenge? Obviously that's something that we don't really know. Coach, however, I think is just outright in a worse spot, unless Sophie and Albert were to really want to flip over the game just to get Coach on their side, which even then I don't really see happening, considering obviously in this scenario they wouldn't have any connection to Coach. Like I don't really see Coach doing particularly well in this scenario, where I just do not see where he maneuvers. Where again, I think he can have the likes of Cochran and Dawn on his side, but that's really all I truly see. I do see him having a more antagonistic relationship with Jim by the end of it, and I just do not see him really clicking with the likes of Keith and Whitney. So again, I just do not think it would go well for Coach there. Next up for Survivor Philippines, this is a bit of a weird one obviously because we have 3 tribes here, and really straight up, I think whatever returnee player was on Matt Singh was more than likely going to be a boot in the pre-merge. Again, it was a tribe that obviously went to tribal 4 times before the merge on a 6-person tribe, and through that only 2 people would survive, and I think Malcolm and Denise would have clicked up and stayed together no matter what the returning player was. Now, realistically, would they have more of a chance to win challenges if like someone like a Scoopin was there? Maybe. But if we're saying that the challenges stay exactly the same, I think whoever was on Matt Singh was kind of screwed to begin with. So with that, we can kind of limit the number of situations that occur after the fact through essentially just eliminating the Matt Singh of it all. So really at this point, we're just going to play through 2 scenarios. One where Scoopin is on Calabao, while Russell Swan is on Tendang, and the other one is where Penner is on Tendang and Mike Scoopin is on Calabao. So let's start off with the Scoopin scenario first. Scoop on Calabao, I do not think it goes well. Now, it probably goes around the same as it did with Penner, where I do think Jeff Kent would be targeting Scoopin from the very beginning, and I think probably lets him survive until the merge over a Katie and a Dawson. Like, Dawson for sure However, I think even Katie, it's like at that point, I think Jeff wanted him around as a bigger target for the merge, and also had the worry of an idol, which to be fair, does Scoopin find an idol? Probably not, but I do think more than likely Scoopin still makes the merge in that scenario, and in this scenario also, Russell Swan would have an easy run to the merge through being on Tendang. However, I think also on Tendang, I think Russell probably still ends up being on the bottom as well. And also, I don't really see him clicking with Lisa as much as Scoopin did. Now, I could still see that relationship happening out of necessity, just because I think most of the tribe was very anti-Returnee to begin with, particularly the likes of Pete Artis and Abby Maria. But like, can Russell and RC possibly align? Maybe. Like, I feel like Russell and Artis would get along better than Artis and Scoopin, but that's not really saying much. So I do feel like Russell would probably be better off on Tendang than Scoopin, outside of probably lacking a super close relationship. But I mean, coming into the merge, it really just is a bit of a train wreck. In the original scenario, Penner was this big target that they went after. Penner's obviously not here in this scenario. So would Jeff Kent just let Scoopin go in this scenario? But also in this scenario, would Scoopin and Lisa align, considering they had like an instant connection from what we know? Like, really, I feel like Scoopin probably had more room to maneuver than Penner did immediately after the merge. So maybe they wouldn't go that route. Instead, just vote out RC outright. To where essentially at this point in the game, I mean, we might as well just say that Scoopin is in the Penner spot, just not as likely to win. And Russell's kind of in the Scoopin spot, but probably more likable, I guess. But yeah, really, some of the game moving forward probably stays at. The question is Russell willing to flip against Tendang? And to be honest, I don't think he is. Like, unless it's a situation where they completely isolate him in the way they did with Scoopin, which to be fair, they might. But even then, Russell isn't really that big of a player. He's really a pretty loyal guy. There's never a point in Survivor history where he actually wants to flip against someone he made an agreement with, unless he's like absolutely forced to which Scoopin ends up being that person in the real scenario that forces Lisa to flip over afterwards. But if Russell doesn't have that killer instinct in him, I don't know if he's really in it for the long haul here. I think he's probably just going to give Tendang the numbers, to which they probably would steamroll at that point, outside of potential idols and whatnot. While Scoopin probably goes out along the way. In the other scenario we have to talk about, we have Russell on Calabao, while we have Penner on Tendang, and really, I think things play out mostly the same. Again, I think Russell is still this antagonistic figure for Jeff Kent. However, I still think they allow Russell to get to the merge. On the other side of things, we have Penner on Tendang, and really, I think Penner probably clicks with Tendang a lot more than the other two. Again, Scoopin and Russell both, to me, don't really feel like they fit naturally within that group. However, I think Penner would fit better. I mean, Penner always had a good relationship with the likes of Pete and Artis and Lisa and even RC. The problem was obviously that he was already looked at as such a massive target, and like, to be fair, he might still be looked at as a massive target on Tendang, but I think he would have been better at building social relationships at that point. But I think at the merge vote, I think more than likely Russell is the easy vote there. And from that point on, like, pretty much the game would probably play out similarly to the real life scenario. Again, Penner, I still think maneuvers through the game in a similar way that he did in real life, just without as big of a target on his back, and would also get some of the positioning of Scoopin, though again, I think more of a target on his back than Scoopin did. So it probably would be a scenario where maybe he would be able to align with like the likes of Lisa, Denise, and Malcolm to run the game, but also at the same time, again, there's no way they're going to let him get anywhere close to the end. So again, it's kind of a conflicting thing there, but I think Penner's probably set up better to win the game, while I think Russell's probably just out at the merge. And finally, we got the last scenario we're going to be talking about, and this is from Survivor Edge of Extinction, where here we're going to talk about what if Kelly and David swapped over to Kama, while Joe and Aubrey swap over to Manu. And the first thing that comes to mind right away, again, while I've been playing these scenarios as if challenges stayed the same, I think 100% Manu dominates the pre-merge if Aubrey and Joe are on their side. Obviously, Joe is just such a massive asset to begin with. But again, that tribe also has the likes of Chris and Lauren O'Connell, which are two massive assets as well. Like, I do feel like Manu at that point would feel like this extremely dominant tribe. Though to be fair, Kama would also still have the likes of an Eric and a Gavin and Aurora and these like competent physical competitors, but I do feel like the tribes probably swap. To which, if Kama is going to tribal, I do think Kelly and David are probably screwed unless they have idols. Again, Kama was a very anti-returnee group, to where I could definitely see Kelly and David trying to pull over the likes of like a Gavin and a Julia and a Ron Clark and a Julie, but like I just do not know how successful it would be. Like we do know that Kelly and Gavin had a really good relationship. So I do feel like David is probably the first boot in this scenario. I do feel like he is the person that I see struggling with building relationships with this group. However, again, if they are continuing to go to tribal after tribal, like I feel like Kelly's probably also out before the merge, considering the massive target on her back in this scenario. Well, at this point, that means Aubrey and Joe more than likely make the merge. But again, Joe is one of these people that's, again, every time he makes the merge, he's probably going to be the first boot. And to be honest, even then, like with Aubrey, it's probably not a guarantee considering she was taken out after the swap in the real life scenario anyway. So like really, I just think this season was just overall kind of doomed for the returnee players. I think we actually got the best case scenario for the returnee players, where the likes of David and Kelly found inroad on the original Manu. Well, again, I think if we swap the tribes, they're probably just doomed from the beginning on Kama. Well, Joe was always almost an instant threat. And Aubrey, again, could probably still be sniped out of the game around the swap. And even if she isn't, she does have a long road ahead of her to where I wouldn't expect her to make it all the way to the end. So I think really the returnee players are kind of doomed there either way. But there we go. And that's every season of Survivor with returnee captains. Now moving forward, obviously stay tuned for more Survivor What If videos, more rankings, more other random stuff like that. But for now, that is the video. Thank you for watching.